Thank you, ladies and gentlemen, for your time and attention this morning. I know it's a long morning, and now that you ate lunch, hopefully we won't put you to sleep. So thank you, though, for being honest in your answers so that we can pick the most fair and impartial jury for this trial. This is a criminal trial, as you heard, commenced against the state of New Mexico against Dean Cummings. And I'm going to play for you a phone call from a 911 operator to the Sandoval County Sheriff's Office dispatch that was made on February 29th of 2020. And hopefully I can. Let me see. I bet my audio's on. Nothing like electronics. Is it on the court thing?
Pardon me?
On the podium thing? Because I have it plugged in.
Is Jason here? Give me a second. Beginning.
That's okay. I'll proceed without it.
Pardon me?
I'll proceed without it.
Okay, if you need it, IT is coming in, but you may continue.
There we go. Plugged in. And that was the last trial. That's okay. I'll proceed without it.
Okay.
Thank you for your time and attention, ladies and gentlemen. Nothing like technology to put a bump in the road, right? Ladies and gentlemen, as you heard, or you can guess from Vaudier, this case isn't about who did it or how it was done. This case, the facts for you to decide are whether or not this homicide was committed in self-defense or whether it was committed with or without sufficient provocation. A second-degree murder is a homicide that was committed without having been sufficiently provoked, whereas a voluntary manslaughter is a homicide committed after having been sufficiently provoked. And the judge is going to give you the definitions to all of these things and what that law means. This case, ladies and gentlemen, is a case about reasonableness. And you, ladies and gentlemen, are the finders of the facts. The state has the burden of proof of showing that Dean Cummings, the defendant in this case, committed this homicide beyond a reasonable doubt. And the state will also show that the defendant, Mr. Cummings, also committed the crime of tampering with evidence. And that is because he washed his face, his hands, and changed his clothing after committing that homicide. And the state will also show that he committed the crime of concealing identity, because when law enforcement came and interacted with him, he didn't give his identity to them. The evidence is going to show, ladies and gentlemen, that on
Ms. Walker,
February...
Ms. Walker, IT person is here if you want it.
That's okay. I'll just proceed. It's fine.
Okay.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Yes. So, ladies and gentlemen, the evidence is going to show that on February 29th of 2020, at Guillermo Arriola's ranch, which is way out past Cabazon Peak, in the far remote area of Sandoval County, New Mexico, a ranch that is so remote that there is no cell phone service out there. And a ranch that is so remote that law enforcement had to use GPS coordinates on the search warrants. The evidence is going to show that the defendant killed Guillermo Arriola in his trailer. And the evidence will show that Mr. Arriola had been contemplating selling this ranch to Dean Cummings. He had his realtor, Christine Landers, draft up a real estate contract to sell this property to Mr. Cummings. Mr. Cummings had time to contemplate the purchase of this property and had not yet signed the real estate contract at the time of the homicide. On February 29th, 2020, Guillermo Arriola drove out to his ranch out in Sandoval County to meet with Mr. Cummings. Mr. Cummings shot and killed Mr. Arriola with a Sig Sauer AR-15 rifle. This rifle had a 30-round magazine and a scope on it. Mr. Arriola was 47 years old at the time of his death, and he was shot 2 times that day. He was shot once in the head and once in the chest. Law enforcement came and processed the scene, and they recovered 10 casings, spent casings, from that bedroom where he was shot. In Mr. Arriola's right hand was a can of mace, and that can of mace was facing Mr. Arriola, not outwards towards any attacker, but facing him and his body. You will be asked to determine whether the reasonableness of Mr. Cummings' actions when he committed this homicide. Were his actions reasonable when he shot and killed Mr. Arriola with an AR-15? Initially, when law enforcement went, Mr. Cummings refused to identify himself when the deputies made contact with him. And Mr. Cummings told the Sandoval County Sheriff's deputies that he killed Mr. Arriola in self-defense because he was sprayed with a neurological agent, presumably the mace. Mr. Cummings told deputies that he washed himself off to get rid of the neurological agent and that he changed his clothing. Now let's talk about the evidence that's going to be presented to you over the next week, week and a half. You're going to hear testimony from Christine Landers. Ms. Landers is going to tell you that she drafted that real estate contract for Mr. Arriola to sell the land to Mr. Cummings. She's going to tell you that she met Mr. Cummings and Mr. Arriola about a month before the homicide to go over this real estate contract. She's going to tell you that Mr. Cummings had his 5th will parked on the ranch property. And you're also going to hear testimony from David McCullough. Mr. McCullough will tell you that on February 29th, 2020, which was a leap day, he was out riding his ATV out in the middle of the desert at Cabazon Peak, and he came upon Mr. Cummings. Mr. Cummings spoke with him and conversed with him for about an hour, and then Mr. Cummings asked him to come with him to witness the body. Mr. Cummings told Mr. McCullough that he killed a man in self-defense and he wanted him to witness the body. Mr. McCullough followed Mr. Cummings back to the ranch, and Mr. McCullough will tell you that he had medical training, so he believed he could render aid to anybody who was injured, so that's why he went back to the trailer, to the ranch, to see if he could render aid. Mr. McCullough will tell you that Mr. Arriola was past the point of aid being rendered. The defendant, Dean Cummings, told Mr. McCullough that he had used the rifle in the back of his truck to kill Mr. Arriola. Mr. McCullough will tell you that he saw the rifle in the back of Mr. Cummings' truck, and then he proceeded to drive to an area where he could get cell phone service. Mr. Cummings stayed back at the ranch while Mr. McCullough drove out to get cell phone service. The area was so remote that it took him several times to get in touch with a 911 dispatch. And you'll hear those calls, and they continue to be dropped. He made about 4 calls to 911. You'll hear those calls. Mr. McCullough waited for law enforcement, and then he led them to the remote area where the ranch was located. After Mr. McCullough called law enforcement, then Mr. Cummings also called law enforcement. You're going to hear testimony from several Sandoval County Sheriff's deputies. You're going to hear testimony from Deputy Hayden Walker. He was one of the initial responding officers that responded on February 29th, 2020. You'll hear that he met Mr. McCullough, and Mr. McCullough led him into the ranch. And you'll hear that Mr. Cummings told him he killed Mr. Arriola in self-defense because he was sprayed with a neurological agent. Deputy Walker placed Mr. Cummings in the back of his patrol car while they conducted the investigation. And Mr. Cummings tells the deputies that he placed the rifle on the porch and that he had the magazine, he took the magazine out, and they were both laying on the porch for them. Mr. Cummings tells Deputy Walker that he washed his face off and his hands and changed his clothing. You'll also hear testimony from Deputy Jonathan Crispin, and he also responded to the scene with Deputy Walker. They secured the scene. They made contact with Mr. McCullough. He collected some witness statements while he was there on scene. And then they secured the perimeter. They went into the trailer to make sure that there was nobody else that was injured. And then they held the scene until the remainder of law enforcement can come. You're going to hear testimony from Sergeant Thomas Griffin, another officer with the Sandoval County Sheriff's Office. And he was the on-scene sergeant out there at the ranch. He arrived with Deputy Gutierrez, and he was present when Mr. Cummings was evaluated by Emergency Medical Services. Mr. Cummings told Sergeant Griffin that the clothing he was wearing at the time of the homicide was in the back of his truck. So Deputy Griffin collects those clothing, and he's going to tell you that the clothing was indeed wet, as if Mr. Cummings had washed himself off. Sergeant Griffin also assisted with the towing of the vehicles from that ranch. They towed the vehicle of Guillermo Arriola. They towed the vehicle of Mr. Cummings, his truck, as well as the fifth wheel. Sergeant Griffin also collected the evidence. So in this homicide, the Sandoval County Sheriff's Office called the New Mexico State Police, and they come out and they assist with the crime scene. So he collected the evidence from the New Mexico State Police that was collected from the scene that day, and he's the one who tags it into evidence. You'll also hear testimony from Lieutenant Frank Tomlinson, our case agent here. He was assigned this investigation, and he's the one who was in charge of making sure everything got done. Lieutenant Tomlinson assisted with the investigation while working out of the Sandoval County Sheriff's Office, which is right here in the courthouse, while Thomas Griffin was the one at the ranch. Because there was no cell phone service, they had to play telephone tag, if you will, to get sure the warrants done. He wrote several warrants, and he interviewed several witnesses, and you're going to hear about all of that part of the investigation. He also transported the evidence. As I stated, the New Mexico State Police assisted with this investigation by processing the scene, and you're going to hear testimony from Carlos Herrera, the New Mexico State Police case agent. He was the criminalistics agent, so he was the one in charge of making sure all of the evidence is documented and collected. New Mexico State Police arrived at the ranch after the warrants were granted so that they collect and document everything. He'll tell you about the processing of the scene. One person is assigned to take photographs. One person is assigned to scan the scene. And he was assigned with documenting the casings, the trajectory, where the blood was, and things like that. Agent Herrera is going to tell you that he collected 10 spent casings from the scene that day. He collected the mace, and he collected the AR-15 rifle. Agent Bogue, also to the New Mexico State Police in the criminalistics portion, she was assigned with running what's called a Leica scanner, and it's a scanner that scans the whole room, and she uses the information from that scan to create a diagram. And she'll testify about the diagram that she created that documents where the body is, where the casings were, and the outline of the house. And you're finally going to hear from Jennifer Otto. She is the New Mexico Department of Public Safety DNA analyst. She's going to testify about the analysis of the evidence that was sent to her for review and whose DNA was on what and what kind of DNA it was. And finally, you'll hear from Dr. Heather Gerald of the Office of Medical Investigator. She is the chief medical investigator there at UNM, and she conducted the autopsy of Guillermo Arriola. She's going to testify that Mr. Arriola had 2 gunshot wounds to his body. The first gunshot wound was to the head, and it entered at the right temple with a trajectory of right to left and downward. Dr. Gerald will testify that there was a second gunshot wound of the chest, and it entered at the supraclavicle region of the chest and exited the left side of the chest. As I stated, ladies and gentlemen, this is a case of reasonableness. A second-degree murder is a homicide committed without having been provoked, and a voluntary manslaughter is a homicide committed after having been sufficiently provoked. And the judge is going to give you the definition of what sufficient provocation is. Again, this case isn't about who did it or how it was done. The facts for you, ladies and gentlemen, are to decide whether this homicide was committed in self-defense or whether it was committed with or without sufficient provocation. This is a case of reasonableness, and you are the finders of fact. You are going to determine whether or not Mr. Cummings' actions were reasonable on that day when he shot and killed Mr. Arriola with an AR-15 rifle when he only had mace. And I surmise to you that the evidence will show that there was no struggle in the bedroom, that little bedroom on February 29th, 2020, and the evidence will show that this was not a justified homicide. Mr. Arriola cannot speak about what happened in that little room on that day, but the evidence will show what happened on that day. And at the end of the case, the state, we're going to ask you to find Mr. Cummings guilty of second-degree murder or the lesser included offense of voluntary manslaughter for the killing of Guillermo Arriola. And we will ask you to find the defendant guilty of tampering with evidence for him washing his hands, his face, and changing his clothes after the homicide. And we will ask you to find him guilty of concealing his identity when he refused to identify himself to the law enforcement officers on that day. And thank you for your time.
Ms. Moss.